Thank you all for coming. I'm Carly Summers. I'm with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Essex County. And there are actually quite a few ag service professionals, extension folks, soil and water, extension folks from other areas. So instead of saying thank you to everybody individually, I'd like to just say thank you to all of you together. And also thank you so much to the farmers for coming and making time. Thank you to the historic Grange here for hosting us, which we love to work with you here. And so just to let you know the format, we're going to have a presentation, then a break for questions and answers after each section of a few different themes. So first, Dr. Kaiser is going to talk about why native grasses. Then his student, Keagan, is going to talk about establishing native grasses. So after each of these themes, you can ask questions for about 10 minutes we've scheduled. Then there will be managing native forages, wildlife benefits of native grasses, and then we're going to have more time after all of that for optional Q&A. If you don't have time to stick around for that, that's fine. And so also, feel free to snack in the back. We have lots of good food from several local farms. We visited North Country Creamery today, so there's 3 cheeses from them. We have Sugar House Creamery cheese. We have Triple Green Jade crackers and River Rails muffins. And we also have vegetables and fruits from Juniper Hill Farms, so thank you to them. And finally, thank you to Dr. Kaiser and his team for coming all the way from the University of Tennessee. So Dr. Kaiser is the leading researcher on the study of native warm season forages. He's researched all aspects of them for decades. He runs the Center for Native Grasses in Tennessee. He has worked with people all over the country in the whole eastern United States, so from way up high in the north all the way down in the southern regions. So he has co-authored over 70 grants, $42 million worth of research. This is a subject that has been looked into, and he knows about it. So we're really excited that he's here. And like I said, we would love for you to ask questions while he's talking. Feel free to just think of anything that you're curious about or confused about, and then whenever he's done with his presentation, we'll take questions. So how's that sound? All right. Thank you all.
All right, great. Hey, great to be with you all here today in beautiful Essex County, New York. First time up here. Really remarkable country. Kind of just a treat, really, just to be able to come up here. And I particularly want to thank Carly, not only for the invitation, but Carly, thank you for inviting me up here during summer. I don't think I want to be up here in the wintertime. I love y'all, I love everybody, but I'm a little bit frightened by what it might look like in January. So. And with that, I'm going to jump into talking about these native grasses. And as Carly said, what I want to do is I want to start out with just kind of an overview, just kind of introducing you to these grasses in kind of a general perspective. Oh my gosh, I can't do that. I can't. He wants me to stand behind the podium. I can't do that. You know, my wife is crazy, and I know that's true because 1, she married me, and 2, she thinks I have ADD. Can you imagine that? Anyway, so these native grasses, one way to look at them, there's a guy who for many years was in the forage business, University of Kentucky extension specialist, and he loved talking about tools in the toolbox. So what we're here to talk about today is a tool that whether you recognize it or not, whether you know it or not, whether you care or not, it is in your toolbox. It exists, it's available, and you can use it. And part of the question is, well, what does that tool do? We had some fun. We were on the front porch of an old farmhouse down in Alabama many years ago, and there was a tool on the front porch that none of us could figure out what it was. And there are tools out there that we're just not familiar with, right? And so because of where we've been through history in the past 50, 100 years, 150 years, we don't necessarily know what this tool is. A lot of us don't. So that's part of my responsibility this evening. I want you to understand this tool, what it can do for us, maybe what it can't do for us. So you see a little grocery list there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through very briefly each one of those and talk about maybe why you might want to consider using these grasses. So let's start off talking about this drought thing. So I don't know, do y'all do droughts up here? I mean, I got rained on all afternoon. So maybe you do droughts up here? So, okay. Because Yeah, right. Well, we like droughts in the fescue belt, that's sort of the middle latitude part of the country, and that is not an uncommon sight right there in the fescue belt. And that is a fescue pasture that's all burned up because it hasn't bothered to rain for 6 or 8 weeks, right? That particular shot is a picture I took in North Missouri. That morning it went from D2 to D3 drought, so it was a Thursday, July. And that very same day, about an hour later, a guy I was with took that picture. Okay, that's a big blue stem Indian grass, little blue stem pasture. And the farm manager, while we were there for this tour, was out hunting for more cattle to put in there because he couldn't keep up with the forage. Okay, do you like this better or that better? Well, if you're trying to raise cattle, I suspect this is the answer, right? And so part of the explanation, and I'm not going to get into the physiology, it would bore you to tears and I'd get confused myself. But this is what we refer to as a C3 or cool season grass, okay? It likes spring, it likes fall, it likes 70 degrees. Think Oregon, right? Never stops raining, kind of cool all the time, New Zealand, Scotland. This is a C4 grass. Think Oklahoma, think Texas, okay? And that's what we call a warm season grass. And so a great tool for droughts. Now, I told you C3, C4, which has to do with plant physiology and metabolism, photosynthesis more specifically. There's another reason native grasses are a very good tool for drought, and that is, and I like to use a lot of fancy scientific terminology, as you'll see. So what we're looking at here is known as big honking roots. You all got that? Okay. That's our science term for the night, big honking roots. But the point is, these native grasses produce these legendarily high volume, deep roots that are the origin of our prairie soils. And they're extremely valuable for surviving drought, but they also do a bunch of other things. Has anybody, I don't know if this thing has caught on in northern New York, but has anybody here heard the term soil health in the past 10 years? We hear it about 75 times a day in Tennessee. It's like, okay, we get the message, right? But what is soil health? And I might have a doctor by my name, but I don't consider myself very smart. I'm more get by faking it. So when I think about soil health, I need some easy way to grasp it. And the way I grasp it is ROOTS. That's how you spell soil health. And if you look at every one of these things, it's considered a benchmark, a foundation, a bedrock of soil health. Every last one of them is directly attributable to roots, ROOTS. And by the way, there's something interesting going on in the United States. Maybe you all have heard about, maybe you haven't, but this thing here we're terming our Grasslands Partnership is one of the USDA's recent climate smart commodity projects. We got funded for it at the University of Tennessee. And the underlying premise is that carbon that you're going to put in the soil and that soil health is something that you can, figuratively speaking, take to the bank, okay? I'm still creating problems, aren't I? It's something you can take to the bank. And the way we're envisioning this unfolding is that by good stewardship that creates that underground bank of carbon and lower inputs is that farmers can take advantage of that by either A, getting a premium in the marketplace, or B, and this is a little darker picture, having access to the future marketplace, right, for our cattle. And so we don't really know how all that's going to unfold. We haven't even started the project. We've got the funding coming to us, but it is completely foundationally based on roots and what they can do for low input farming and high carbon storage farming. So I think it's more than just a rough concept of soil health. There's a lot more to it. Another thing these grasses can do for us, and I hope you've seen a curve like this. So there's our cool season growth curve, things like fescue, timothy, orchard grass, maybe more fescue oriented with our little surge in the fall. And here's our warm season growth curve. One detail I want to point out to you is this is what we will call an anatomically correct growth curve. In other words, the size of that growth curve, the amount of forage being produced under each curve is actually calibrated to the actual documented productivity of those grasses. So one thing you'll see is that curve for the warm seasons is much taller. But probably more importantly is that when we have this gap in summer forage production, which is probably less pronounced up here than it is in our part of the world, but can still exist, these warm season grasses can make up that gap and therefore give us more grazing days, particularly in summer. Another thing about these natives is, did I mention that they are native? They are from North America. They are adapted to the conditions of North America. And by the way, these grasses, I could show you a range map, for instance, a big blue stem. So northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan up in there, down to Florida and into Mexico and Central America and up to where we are standing today. These things grew across the entire continental United States and Canada, east of the Rockies, where there was enough moisture. So eastern Colorado, not so much, except down in the river valleys, but across the central plains to the Atlantic shore, we had these grasses growing. And so they're adapted to our conditions, and depending on which species you pick, they can fit almost any condition you can find on your farm. So a couple of extreme conditions where people tend to struggle to produce forage, one of them is these soaking wet sites. So this is all sedge right here. So bulrushes, sedges, things like that that's growing in this field. This farmer was getting no productivity out of this site because it was too wet-natured and couldn't cut hay until summer, and because it was mostly sedge and wet weather plants like that, couldn't get much value out of it. So switchgrass, a species that's well adapted to very saturated soils. And so what you see right there is the seedlings fighting for a position in this stand. So these were planted probably 2-3 months before that picture was taken. Kind of still looks like a mess. A year or two later, I believe that's 2 years later, that's that same field, beautiful stand of switchgrass. This guy went from getting almost no production of that out of that field to being able to carry every cow he had on that field for the summer, okay? He took a marginal site and made it a cornerstone of his forage program. That's one of the things adapted grasses can do for you. This scene here is from a strip bench. Maybe that's a term that doesn't make any sense up here. I know some of these guys are in here getting kind of excited. They heard about a strip bench. No. I'm not talking about that. This is surface mining in eastern Kentucky, okay? We're extracting coal, and it's not a huge, vast area, you know, mountaintop removal kind of thing you may have heard of, but this is an area of maybe a few hundred acres that might be, you know, 500 feet wide and several thousand feet long, and it's on a contour. And so when they're reclaimed, one of the things we did is we planted the same mixture of native grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem. We couldn't carry every cow a guy had on that because there wasn't soil up there. It was rock. If you look in the soil survey, somebody here's from the Soil and Water Conservation District. Soil survey, this isn't soil. It's unconsolidated fill is what they call it, right? Because it's a rocky mountaintop that's been torn to pieces. So our carrying capacity was really low, but we got a beautiful stand of that grass and could graze a bunch of steers, weaned steers and heifers up there and get some very, very good rates of gain on them. So again, we took a very poor site that really was just growing rocks and turned it into a productive pasture. So the take home there is, give me the sorriest, most unproductive site that you have, and I can get a native grass to grow on there. It may not produce a huge number of tons, but I expect I can outproduce an introduced grass on that same site, no matter how poor, how wet, or somewhere in between. So again, adaptability equals more grazing days. Places that you couldn't graze, now you can. One other benefit, I know y'all never see pastures that look like this up here, but that's a cool season dominated pasture that's getting, and again, I hate using all these big scientific terms, and if you can't keep up, raise your hand. But the correct terminology here is getting the tar beat out of it, okay? So there we got a pasture that's getting the tar beat out of it in the middle of summer. And here's something kind of fun we've known for decades. You know, not all science is new science, y'all. That's a picture from 1955, USDA project. And guess what? Grasses that have big tops have big roots. Kind of shocking, right? Grasses that, again, this one technically here has the tar beat out of it, right? And look at that root system. So you tell me, if a drought were to come along starting the next day, which one of those 4 plants would survive best? And if you can't pass that test, we need to get kindergarten started for y'all, okay? So that's pretty straightforward. So this pasture, if you had to guess, where are we? Well, the answer is we're over on this side of the ledger, right? We're not doing so good. And so that's never good for soil health. Remember, ROOTS. It's not good for carbon storage. It's not good for drought resilience, and it's not good for grass production. In fact, I'm not sure what it is good for, but it's bad news all around. Doesn't that look a little bit better? So that is an alternative for the summer. That is a nice, I don't know, Keagan, you and I were up there that same evening. I'm thinking that was about a 3, maybe 4-year-old blue stem stand where they turned the cattle in there that evening. And again, that is a much better place to be in the summer to allow the cool season grasses to rest and remain vigorous, right? So there's another way we sort of increase grazing days. So we got this drought resilient grass that can allow us to have more grazing days, particularly during the summer, but also on marginal sites. Well, another thing these grasses can do is give us a whole lot of yield. And I pointed that out on that yield curve, but let me point it out here again. So the blue bar is from the University of Kentucky, and that's their color. They like blue, so we tried to be nice to them. What that is, that's the mean yield over a 7-year period for 5 different species of native grass, each one of which had maybe, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 entries, so different cultivars or varieties. And so that's a whole bunch of data that goes into that mean. And the take-home message is that even though the yield bounced around year to year, over that 7-year period, it averaged 5 tons or 4.5 tons per acre. This is 13 cultivars of warm season grasses of 2 species, so we had fewer species. This is one we did at Tennessee, and did I mention we like orange in Tennessee? Hey, do y'all know where Tennessee is? Could you find it on a map? You could. I want to tell you a funny story. My sons and I were out in Wyoming, and we left Wyoming early October being chased out of town by a freaking blizzard. And we've been out there hunting, and we made it to extreme western Nebraska, a town called Ogallala. Anybody been there? Oh, get out of town. You haven't heard of Ogallala, Nebraska? Anyway, it's a crossroads, right? And we stayed at a hotel, and the girl was checking us in. And she said, where are y'all from? And said, Tennessee. And she had a blank look on her face. And I said, you know where Tennessee is? Not really. so what I told her was, it's on the other side of Missouri. It's just, oh, okay. That satisfied her. Well, how did I get off on that? So we're on orange, right? And so we did a little bit better than them, but in the realm of reason. I mean, basically we're saying 4.5, 5 tons per acre. As fate would have it, at the University of Kentucky, at the same research farm where this trial was being done, they were doing a variety trial on a bunch of different Kentucky 31 releases. Okay, tall fescue, okay, cool season grass. These are warm season grasses, cool season grass. And what you can see is that Kentucky 31 did about 3 tons per acre, which, by the way, is pretty good yield, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But, all right, I'm going to ask you another question. Anybody here ever, you know where Ogallala, Nebraska is, a bunch of show-offs. Have you ever heard of Paul Harvey? I'm looking at this man with gray hair up here, and I'm expecting him to nod his head. Somebody young, have y'all heard of young people? No, because Paul Harvey's been dead a few years. The rest of the story. Paul Harvey was a radio personality, had these really engaging little radio, I don't know what you call them, 3-minute programs, 5-minute programs. Podcast, yeah, you young people. These were podcasts, right? So here's the rest of the story from Paul Harvey. When they did this trial over here, they put out 60 units of nitrogen each year at spring green up, okay? For this trial, we copied them. We started our trial after theirs was done. So we used 60 units of nitrogen. For the Kentucky 31 trial, they used 180 units of nitrogen to produce that 3 tons per acre. Folks, I don't know if you bought any nitrogen lately, but this is pure insanity. You cannot make money. Somebody bought hay cut, that's how you lose money. That's how you go bankrupt, right? Well, not only that, but this was either 1 or 2 harvests per year, okay? This right here on the Kentucky 31, and maybe not surprisingly with 180 units of nitrogen, was 4 harvests a year, okay? So let's think about that. A pass with a mower, maybe a pass with a tedder, a pass with a rake, and a pass with a baler. Anybody bought diesel lately? And that's your time too. You could be at your daughter's softball game instead of making 4 passes across that field, right? So that gets at you several different ways. So good yields. And by the way, I saved you the math because I wasn't sure about the education y'all have up here. I didn't know, I don't know what they teach you up here. So I did the math for you, and that's 56% if you take the average of those 2 bars versus that. That's a 56% bump in yield for 1/3 the nitrogen. I like that deal. You don't have to be but so smart to figure that one out. Okay, so I'm producing a lot of forage, I'm dodging droughts, I'm helping soil health, I'm opening myself up to maybe future markets, I've got more grazing days, but this grass isn't worth a darn, right? This is a low quality forage, okay? Let's just see how low quality it is. So this is, now these are weaned steers, and let me explain something. In the grazing world, we do a lot of our research on weaned steers. I'm not asking you all to go become stocker operators, but the reason that's been done for the past half century or more is because those animals are the most sensitive to forage, and they're going to give you the best signal on the differences between forages, right? So a mama cow, you could feed her straw and she might get by for a while, right? But these steers, if they're not getting fed well, we're going to know about it quickly. So this isn't a gambit to make everybody a stocker operator. It's just a way to compare forages with a really good tool. So we had these 6-weight steers, and then by the way, this all receives 60 units of nitrogen at spring green up, and this comes from several years of data over several replicated pastures. So there's a lot of numbers behind the means I'm showing you. And we were doing 28-day weighs, which normally a 28-day weigh, there's enough noise in there. I don't really respect it. It doesn't mean that much. But when you've accumulated it over 1,000 steers, it starts to mean something, okay? And that's why I feel comfortable showing it to you. So this is what we did. We went out in early May, and so for the first 28 days, so that was, you know, maybe May 5th to June 5th, let's say, but we'll call it the month of May. We're doing just shy of 3 pounds a day on these 6-weight steers. That's a lot of gain, y'all. That's a lot of gain. And the beauty of it is in June, which in Tennessee, June, that's time to pretty much, you know, give up on life, right? It's hot, it's sweaty, it's nasty. The pastures are turning brown. You're just thinking, why don't I live in the Adirondacks, right? Well, and we're still turning some pretty good rates of gain. Same thing in July. Fall off the ledge in August, right? Those are not impressive numbers. But here's tonight's first science test for you. On tall fescue, now tall fescue, I see it up here, but it's not your main forage, right? And I could probably say smooth brome, orchard grass. But what do we do on tall fescue during the summer rate of gain on steers from other studies? Does anybody have a guesstimate or a number that they could throw out just by way of comparison? Because, you know, I throw these numbers up here and I think, well, what do those mean to you, right? See, with frame of reference. Anybody want to hazard a guess? This young man right here. No, I'm talking to you. No, him. No guess. No guess?
I'm thinking maybe you're in the negative.
No, actually, I have seen studies where it is negative, but well under a pound a day. And so my point is that in August, we have now reached sort of fescue levels, right? And even if that isn't very impressive, it's no worse than where I would be on a cool season grass at that time of year, right? Now, this was continuous stocking. We put those steers out there in May, and they stayed on those paddocks all summer long. And so by late summer, those pastures were pretty beat up. Here's a second study we did. Again, same as this mix right here. And we did a couple different shifts in management, still season long. But here we stocked very heavy for the early part of the season. In midsummer, we reduced it. Here we kept the same stocking, so kind of like this. And what we saw is even in late summer, some very good rates of gain. Now, if you take these grasses into a laboratory, they're not going to look that impressive. I want to tell you that right now. So if you're a hay person, or if you're a person who really likes to do your forage sampling and get good data on it, and you take this to the lab, what it's going to come back look like is just sort of blah. It's not going to look bad, although if you get some of that August stuff, the 0.75, yes, it will. But you're not going to be impressed. A forage nutritionist would never be impressed, okay? But as has often been said, the best forage analysis tool is what? What? I thought I heard something. The cow or the animal. That is the ultimate forage analysis tool. Whatever we do in the laboratory is good. I'm not throwing down on labs, but I am saying is if you really want to know the true answer, there's your true answer, okay? That's what these grasses will do for the animal. And so there is a disconnect between the forage quality in the lab and what you see here, okay? And there are several ways to explain that, none of them entirely satisfactory, but the reality is we get some very good rates of gain, and therefore we can conclude it is, contrary to what you may have heard different times in different places about these native grasses, is they're actually very good forages. And there's my proof, okay? And we've done a number of studies on weaned animals weaned heifers, weaned steers, bred heifers. Always on growing classes of animals. Right now we got a study going on cow-calf, and we're seeing really good rates of gain on our calves before weaning. They're outperforming their peers who are not on these grasses. So again, we're very comfortable. One of the things, I know there's some dairy work up here, and I would love to see how this translates into pounds of milk a day. And I don't know. And if there's anybody here who runs a dairy, I would love to trick you into planting some of this so that we can begin to get some insight into that, right? I think that would be very fascinating to be able to understand that relationship. Anyway, what else can we say? Well, how about let's talk about the bottom line, right? So we've talked about drought, we've talked about more grazing days, we've talked about soil health, we've talked about high yields, and we've talked about good animal performance. Let's talk about the bottom line. So this gentleman is admiring his 20-year-old switchgrass pasture, and during that 21-year period, no fertilizer, no spraying, rotational grazing, and an occasional spring fire. I think we can all agree that's what we call low input forage management. And the beauty of a low input forage management is that it means our bottom line looks pretty good. So low cost forages result in low cost of gain, right? And so my ag economist, I probably should have put his name up here, has pencil whipped a lot of these studies for us. And that's what it turns out our cost of gain is. And folks, I can take you to all kinds of commodity feeds and other kinds of feeds out there that can kick some really high rates of gain out for you, right? But until you've looked at cost of gain, don't get too excited about rate of gain, right? And so you really cannot do any better than that right there. Now, I'm not saying you can't do that on other grasses, but I promise you the best rates of cost of gain you will ever see is going to come off a pasture. And those are competitive with about any pasture numbers that I've ever seen. So again, cheap gain because of cheap pastures. And the previous slide, the gentleman I would have acknowledged is Chris Boyer. This is a paper he published with myself and quite a few other people. But we took some summer forages, Bermuda grass, which mercifully all don't have up here, crabgrass, which you do have, and these three natives here that I've referred to at various times. And he looked at it slightly differently than cost of gain. He calculated for us our net return, okay, per acre. And what we see is these natives show up pretty well. And that's not because crabgrass or Bermuda grass are particularly bad forages or there's something inherently wrong with them. It is low input, high yield, high rate of gain. Put those three things together, a lot of pounds per acre at a low cost, high net returns, right? Fairly simple, even for a guy like me. All right, so we've talked about the fact that these grasses have a lot of attributes that are very attractive. The thought occurred to me as I was putting this together is, wait a minute, I'm going up to the North Pole, I mean northern New York. And folks might say, well, Kaiser, that's great. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm sure that looks good in Tennessee and Kentucky and these other places you've referenced. But what about way up here? And I think that is an absolutely fair question, more than fair. And so I put a few slides in here to try to address this. So let's start here. This is from a bunch of ecologists who put this together. And what it shows is that C4 grasses at lower latitudes, so down south, outcompete cool season grasses. What's sort of a no-brainer, right? If I take you down to Alabama and you're cool season grass, you don't want to live. On the other hand, you come way up north, maybe up here somewhere or even further north, these warm season grasses are not as competitive, right? And so the C3 grasses, the cool season grasses, are more competitive. To me, what is interesting about this chart is not to say, gee, warm season grasses do better further south and cool season grasses further north. You didn't need me to tell you that. But what's interesting is based on their analysis, that transition point occurs at about 45 degrees latitude north. And because I had no clue where that was, I found another paper that looked at distribution of warm and cool season grasses. And I put the 45-degree north line on there, which, by the way, is about Minneapolis, Minnesota, okay? And what you can see, the yellow and the red represent where C4, warm season grasses, dominate, and up here is where cool season grasses dominate. Red means almost complete dominance, 90% or better, and the yellow is less, right? We don't need to get too elaborate about that. But what you can see is well into South Dakota, and even though their analysis didn't leak into Minnesota, warm season grasses historically dominated the United States that far north, which is a long way up there. But historically, so much of the eastern United States fell into an area where C4 grasses were clearly dominant. Now, let's talk a little bit just to try to move this from the Great Plains to here, and I'm going to try and help you with my cool arrows here. So that area right there is in this zone right here, which, and again, just to make your life easy and mine as well, that area right there is 4B, okay, that dark blue. That's plant hardiness zone 4B. And where are we right now? Well, we're in this little strip up here, up the Hudson and Champlain valleys right here, that happens to be 5A, so a little milder. And so the point is, where we are standing today is in an area that is south of milder winters than places where C4 grasses have dominated the North American continent for several thousand years, okay? So as strange as it may seem to you, we're in a country where C4 grasses are going to be perfectly at home. Let me ask y'all a question. Has anybody ever seen corn growing in Essex County? No? Come on, y'all. I only been here one afternoon and I've seen it. And you know what corn is? It's an annual grass, and guess what? It's a C4 grass, and it grows right here in Essex County, right? So the point is, we're in an area where we are well within the range of winter hardiness in terms of these warm season grasses. Let me show you another kind of really fascinating study. Mike Kassler, who's kind of a rock star in the forage agronomy world, published this paper a number of years ago. And he took 4 different switchgrass cultivars. You see their names up here. The names aren't important. But what I want you to notice, this particular one from Wisconsin was derived from plant material collected in zone 3B. Okay, that's where you freeze to death. This one was collected from 4B, I believe in South Dakota, 5B, which I think I just said is where we are, if I recall correctly. And this is 6B, so that's getting down into southern Illinois to be precise. Those 4 cultivars were grown at 3 research locations, one of which was in zone 3, one of which was in zone 4, and one of which is zone 5. Doesn't matter where they were in terms of, you know, cities and states. My point is where they were grown north-south. What I want you to see is that in zone 3, all 4 cultivars outperformed the performance for that same cultivar in zone 4. And in zone 4, with the exception over here, they always outperformed the performance of zone 5. In other words, the farther north you went for these switch grasses, irrespective of whether they were derived from the North Pole or southern Illinois, we see the same pattern. More yield further north. Do y'all know you got much longer days in the dead of summer than we have in Tennessee, right? That daylight matters. Here's another study, okay, published just a few years after Mike Kassler's, where they did a bunch of modeling from a bunch of different places where switchgrass had been grown. And what you see is the colors represent the yield potential of switchgrass, okay? And so I want you to see something. Even though it's the thin little strip, you look up here in this Hudson Champlain Valley, and that color right there, that yield potential, as near as I can read it, is the exact same thing as we have back home in East Tennessee. Y'all can grow as many tons of switchgrass per acre as I can in Tennessee. Seems a little crazy to me, seems like it shouldn't be, but the data that we have says, in fact, that it is. You can grow plenty of forage up here with these summer grasses. Also interesting, just to get off switchgrass for a second, there are 5 released cultivars of big blue stem, and this is where they were derived, 4A, 4B, 5A, which is where we are. And by the way, this round tree is probably the most widely planted big blue stem cultivar in eastern North America. Okay, and it was derived from 5A, which is where I'm standing right now, okay? And then 5B, not much further south, Pawnee, okay, out of Nebraska. So the point is, these cultivars and these species, yes, to answer this question, what about way up here? We're fine, okay? We can grow it. So that kind of wraps up my overview of this. I do want to point out this link right here, because what I've given you is a few minutes worth, and we have enough information on that web page to kill anybody, okay? We've got videos, we got something we call the Native Grass College, which is a whole bunch of videos that you can study on and learn from. We've got, you know, a bunch of PDF publications. This one here, Establishing Native Grass Forages in the Southeast, We put Southeast on there because it was done by myself and somebody from Auburn and somebody from Georgia. But the truth is that would apply up here as well. I mean, there might be a few differences, but it would apply widely. And thank you, Carly, for bringing them. But there is this really incredible book. The guy who wrote it's kind of a dunderhead, but the book is really good. But anyway, it's more than you could ever want to know about native grasses, right? But there's a lot of information in there. And so I want to steer you towards this. This is available in hard copy. We mistakenly had our wires crossed and it said it was out of print, but you can get a copy online, purchase one if you don't pick one up here this evening. But all this other stuff can be downloaded and seen for free online. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. But I want to show you this one last picture to me, which sort of tells the story. This is from Virginia, July 18th, 3 in the afternoon, 90 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 100 heat index. And what are those cattle doing? Are they under a shade tree? Are they in a pond? They're out there filling their guts. And you know how cattle grow? Intake, right? You got to have forage in your gut. Cattle under trees and in ponds aren't gaining weight. They're not producing milk. Those things are out there in 100-degree heat index. And a lot of black baldies. It's a commercial herd, but there's a whole lot of dark hide out there. Ain't a shade tree to be seen. So with that, I am going to wrap up the introduction. And I don't know how I did it all on time. Carly, good, fine. Okay, great. We have a little bit of time for questions. So hit me. What you got? I got to stay in front of that thing, don't I? Yes, sir.
Warm grasses for silvopastures? I know typically they like colder.
Yeah, thinking about explicit studies where we've gone out and tried putting different things under trees, I can't think of anything. But I will point out that historically, across much of eastern North America, there was a lot of natural silvopasture, courtesy of the Iroquois and the Cherokee and the Shawnee and so forth, and early American settlers. Fire was everywhere. And these grasses grew then and grow now in partial shade. They like full sun. But if you can break a canopy and get it down to about less than 50% shade, so 50% or more sun, to put it in maybe a better way, you will be able to grow these grasses in that kind of environment. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about fire and how that is used as a management tool and the ecology of the grasses and why it's not something that, I mean, I see people do it a little bit around here or heard of it, but it's not very common.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'm going to do, oh yeah, sure. So the question was, talk a little bit about the fire adaptation of these grasses and how you use it as a tool, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a dirty trick on you because I'm going to explicitly address that in another slide. So if when I bring that up, I don't fully answer your question, remind me. So other questions, comments, criticism? Yes, ma'am.
Do they maintain their property with forage when they make hay?
Yeah. So the question is, do they maintain their forage quality when you make hay? And long and the short of it is that just like any grass, when you cut it at a relatively early stage of maturity, they make very good hays, and those hays do very well. Cattle readily receive them, eat them, and do well on them. So there's not, I mean, obviously any hay isn't going to be as good as fresh forage, but the point is they make a good quality hay. And I'll point out, like in the case of switchgrass can be relatively unforgiving. If you don't hay it on time, that quality can kind of tank on you. So you will meet people who will tell you that switchgrass makes awful hay, and they're right. And you'll meet people who say they love the switchgrass hay and they feed it to the cattle all the time and they do great on it, and they are right. The difference between those two people is when they cut it. So if you cut it when it's still vegetative, before even stem elongation or shortly after, you can get a nice yield of a very good quality hay. On the other hand, if you wait to see a lot of nice seed heads out there and it looks real pretty, it's not going to be good. The quality is going to really go down on you. Blue stem Indian grass is a little more forgiving, but the switchgrass will punish you if you don't do it on time. Yes, ma'am.
When you're doing your trials, what grazing regimes do you use?
Yeah, so on our grazing trials, the question is what grazing regimes do we use? And so we do something that's very commonly done in forage grazing research, and that's called put and take stocking. And so what we will do is we will go out there, say, with 6 steers on a paddock. And as that grass starts to grow and get away from them, we'll shove a couple more steers in there. And when the grass starts to slow down, we'll pull out a steer or two. Now, we do that, no one in their right mind would ever do that running a farm, right? But we're doing that so we can draw growth curves for those grasses. That's why we do it. A number of our other studies that we've done grazing, we don't do that because we feel like we've established the growth curves. And so we have done studies where we rotate, where we use something called patch burn grazing, which I don't intend to get into this evening. We'll be glad to take a question on at some point. And continuous stocking, like that one study I just showed you where, you know, we put the animals out there all season, set stocking, never changed a thing. And we had a second treatment where we had 33% higher stocking early, and then midsummer we dropped it down 33% below the continuous. So we've kind of messed around with some different strategies to manage. And, you know, across the range. We haven't done any of the, you know, y'all hear about management intensive grazing or other terms that we use for that, adaptive grazing, whatever. We haven't actually done studies using that approach, although we're getting ready to start one. So I feel like we've kind of covered the waterfront with that one exception in terms of styles of grazing. And by the way, our results remain relatively consistent almost regardless of which stocking rate. And I think the key is that however we're doing it, we're maintaining that vegetative forage, which again is something I'll talk a little bit more about later. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so for the recording, I'm going to try and encapsulate that. And if I don't get it right, you straighten me out, right? But the question is, if you're maintaining a good, healthy pasture condition for quality forage, in terms of root development, are we on the right side of that picture I showed, or the left side, or the middle? And the answer is probably pretty close to the right side, and in fact, maybe even a little bit better than the right side. Because when John Kreider did that study in 1955, that plant on the right was undisturbed. And what we know is that grazing stimulates, judicious grazing stimulates root production, which, by the way, back to this way to kind of make some extra money off of carbon, we believe that the way grassland farmers are going to do the best job of that is not by putting a fence around the pasture and saying we're not going to touch it, but actually grazing it in a way that leaves some canopy. And that's how we're going to make the most gain in root volume and therefore carbon. So yes, that right-hand side I think is reasonably representative of what you would get in a well-grazed pasture. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about sheep and warm season grasses, both in terms of the stature of the grasses and also specifically, I've heard about switchgrass and toxicity.
Yes, yes. So the question is, how do sheep do on this stuff, right? And part of the question was on switchgrass and toxicity, so I'm going to address that first. Switchgrass is a panic grass. Virtually all panic grasses, I believe all of them, have a compound in them, saponids, okay? And that compound, naturally occurring compound in panic grasses, happens to be very unfriendly to not only sheep, but also horses. And so we never recommend switchgrass for either sheep or horses. Interestingly enough, we're getting ready to start a study. I call it the sheep killing study. That's not on tape, is it? But what we're going to do is we're going to graze sheep on switchgrass pastures at varying levels of intensity. The idea being it's kind of a dosing experiment to see really where that threshold is of negative health consequences. And by the way, we're going to have a vet involved, and it's going to be under Aya Cook guidance, okay? So just calm down. That was for those people out there. But because we really don't know how bad a problem is this? You know, 2 bites and they're dead? Well, no, of course not. Graze it all summer for 100 days and graze absolutely nothing else? Maybe they're subclinical signs, maybe they're clinical. We don't know. That data is not out there, so that's why we want to document it. As far as the stature of sheep and grazing native grasses, I don't have any experience with it personally, but I've talked to a number of people who are doing it, and they say they do absolutely fine with it. So some people get this idea, well, you know, that sheep is down here and the grass is up here. Well, first of all, if your grass is up here, you're not doing a good job of grazing management, okay? If you ever see a seed head on a native grass plant in your pasture, you made a mistake, okay? And if it's this tall, you're probably looking at seed heads. So, and we'll talk more about this, but it ought to be lower. But irrespective, sheep still do a great job of grazing this stuff, and so I would not hesitate to graze sheep on it. I guess the only caution would be is that sheep have a tendency to want to get it nice and snug to the dirt. Can't let them do that. One other question or 0 other questions?
All right. Let's all assume for a second that Dr. Kaiser does a good job this evening selling these grasses to you as a good idea. My job this evening is to kind of guide you through the establishment process and help you get a good stand of them. So right up front, these grasses are a bit more challenging to establish than your general forages like alfalfa or other cool season forages you have up here. This is due to several reasons. One is they have a very small seed that doesn't have a whole lot of energy in it, which leads to slow germination rates. And as the season goes on, even with good germination, your seedlings put most of their energy into their roots during that whole first season. So the above ground plant mass stays small. You can see in this picture here, we've got a bunch of our natives that are 5 or 6 weeks old. And these were near Terrytown, New York, at Stone Barns. So yeah, you can see compared to some of the weeds that have already started to pop up, they're start out very small. So while they do have challenges, these challenges can be overcome with planning ahead and attention to detail. The first thing you want to do is figure out your site selection. The sites that we typically deal with are new ground, crop ground, and hay pasture ground. New ground in this case is land that has been recently cleared of timber, which has its pros and its cons. The pros being that due to being covered in timber for years and years and years before you want to convert it, weed pressure tends to be low. Another thing that doesn't hinder our natives, but may hinder some of the weeds, is the soil pH tends to be low, and the fertility seems to be in the low or medium range. The downside to using clear cutting forest and trying to convert it to these natives is pretty obvious. You have to remove stumps, and it requires a lot of tractor time to till up the ground and then put that ground back into a smooth, firm seed bed. Crop ground, which is one of the, such as row cropping with small grains, soybeans, corn, its big positive is that your ground is already pretty much ready to go. You've probably already been keeping your soil fertility in the medium range as well as your soil pH. And due to years of row cropping practices, the weed pressure tends to be low. Now, hay ground, pasture ground, forage ground is that's where things can get interesting, because weed pressure tends to be high because in order to establish these grasses, you have to get rid of the sod that's already there. And when you till that over or get rid of it however you plan to do so, the seed bank can really explode. So you figure out where you want to plant, where you want to establish these grasses. The next thing you need to do is decide on what species you're going to use. The 5 species that we tend to deal with are big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, eastern gamma grass, and switchgrass. Dr. Kaiser has already mentioned several of these. But the ones that we like to recommend are the big blue stem, little blue stem, and Indian grass. from yeah. So we like to recommend those because they are some of the easier ones to establish, and they're also easy to manage while keeping a high rate of productivity. They also have many wildlife benefits, which Dr. Kaiser will get into later. So you have your site, you have your species of native grass you want to plant. The next thing you need to do is prepare your soil. These native grasses, as I said earlier, do not store a lot of energy in their seeds and therefore need a very clean, firm seed bed with fine textured soil surfaces with a near complete elimination of competition. This, again, pointing at our down at Stone Barns where we're doing some experiments. This is an experiment kind of seeing how these seeds deal with thatch cover. But the bare ground back there, as well as these two fields, are really good examples of a clean, firm seed bed that we're looking for when we go to establish these grasses. All right, so this is what you want. How do you get there? First, you need to eliminate whatever vegetation was there, before you decided to switch over. The best practice for this is to, especially if you're going from a cool season forage, is to eliminate the current sod in the fall and then plant a winter annual such as like wheat as a ground cover to reduce erosion and possibly as a forage or crop over the winter. If you're dealing with a warm season plants in your area where you're wanting to convert, you need to begin that elimination process in late summer when those plants are still active, so they can, if you're using herbicide or. Yep. All right. So you've started the process of eliminating the weeds and vegetation that are there. The next thing you need to decide is when you go to plant, what process are you going to use? Are you going to go no-till or conventional? Both of these practices work just fine. They just work slightly different ways. We tend to recommend no-till because, again, your seed bed is already firm, so why mess that up? It retains moisture better, less erosion, and it reduces your tractor time, which, as Dr. Kaiser has already mentioned, can be a big deal on cost savings. The other thing is that we recommend planting these native grasses with a drill to ensure uniformity of depth and just have a, to kind of eliminate factors. Just make sure you have a good seeding depth because that's very important. Let's see. And you want to use a broad spectrum herbicide about 2 weeks before planting. Conventional. So if you're going to go conventional, that's fine. But you need to make sure after you till, you go back over that land with a cultipacker or some sort of grading system that packs down that soil enough to, if you walk across it, you don't want your boot to sink more than about quarter of an inch, half an inch. Like, you want it to be pretty firm. And the other thing about using conventional, which can be a positive, is you can use a broadcast seeder. You just have to use a slightly higher seeding rate. I say it's a positive because not everybody has a seed drill that can handle these natives. Yeah. So yeah, speaking of equipment, let's see, yeah. The systems I've used before are the Truax, which is right here in this photo, and then Great Plains drills. I'm sure there are many other companies that make these, but these are the ones that I've worked with. And what you need to look for is a seed drill that has a native grass hopper, a native grass hopper, because these seeds, they're tiny, but they have large awns on them. So unless you get seed that has been cleaned, which you can do from certain providers, you need to have a native grass hopper. If you do get clean seed, you can just use a standard small seed hopper. Let's see. Yeah. Oh yeah, the other thing, a lot of times you can rent these drills from local conservation, fish and wildlife agencies. All right, so we've talked about cost saving a little bit. And Kaiser has already mentioned this. Fertilization for these, soil fertilization is pretty much unnecessary in most cases during the establishment period. These natives can handle low fertility a lot better than some of their competition. So having soil that's a little bit impoverished can actually be a benefit because it reduces your weed pressure. This is especially the case with nitrogen. The annual weeds and other plants can uptake that nitrogen and use it a lot quicker than our natives can. So especially once you have a stand, you can fertilize and get more production out of it using fertilizer, but in the establishment year, it's not recommended. Another thing is these grasses can handle low pH, so unless your pH is below 5, there's really no need to lime. So let's see. The big thing with these, one of the other big things with these seeds is they don't tend to germinate very well until the soil reaches 65 degrees. So we typically recommend planting shortly before that happens. However, you can plant early in the spring or as late as July, as long as you're early if your weed control is really well, and into July as long as you think you're going to have good moisture levels for the next several weeks. Think of at least for the next 4 weeks or so, if not longer. The big thing though here is the planting depth. These seeds, again, do not have a lot of energy. So we need to try and drill them into the soil at about 1/4 of an inch. Anything more than 1/2 inch and you can reduce your germination rates. So when you're planting at 1/4 of an inch, a certain percentage, if you're looking down the row, you're going to see soil just on the seeds just on the surface, and that's okay because we really do want good seed soil contact, but very shallow seeding. Another thing is in that earlier slide, I showed a picture of patches of thatch. That's a experiment going on at Stone Barns, but I've done those experiments previously, and having thatch as little as 1/2 inch can reduce your germination by 50%. So you really do need that clean seed bed. The mix we typically recommend the big blue stem, little blue stem, and Indian grass. One of the reasons we like to use it is they work well together. And so they have slightly different growth habits and how high they structure. And so they kind of benefit wildlife in that way, as well as having kind of a dynamic, different, when they're grazed, it makes a varied, physicality. But yeah, so that's one of the benefits of them. Switchgrass and eastern gamagrass are great forages, but they don't play well with others. And so, they're great to use, but they can't really be used in a mix. Oh, well. So this is, a ratio of 6 pounds, 1 pound, and 3 pounds pure live seed. All right, so you know where you're planting, you've got your equipment, you know how you've got your soil prepared, now it's time to plant. Right after planting, you're going to want to use an imazapic-based herbicide as a pre-emergence herbicide to keep your big weeds under control. Crabgrass, signal grass, young Johnson grass, I'm not exactly sure. Kaiser's already mentioned this. I don't know which of these is the biggest problem for you guys up here, but the imazapic, that group, the big blue, little blue, and Indian grass, are tolerant of the imazapic. So while it can get rid of a lot of their weeds, they seem to be okay with it. However, the eastern gamma and switchgrass are not. So this is specifically for that combination. Yeah. All right. So you've successfully planted your seed. The next thing you need to do is be patient. These natives can take, in a good situation, take 3 weeks to germinate. So the things you need to do are be patient and continue your weed control. These seedlings, as I've said before, spend their first season putting roots into the ground, so their above ground structures do not get very impressive even with perfect growing conditions, but they are putting deep roots in the ground, and if they make it to tillering, they will overwinter. So, and they don't have to be very big to tiller. These plants back here, I don't know that you can really see tillers, but these plants back here are big enough to overwinter, which is our goal. And your goal by the end of the season is to have 1 or more plants per square feet. And if you have less than 1 plant per 4 square feet, you need to think about reseeding. If you need to use a broadleaf herbicide or cut, you can, but just try not to get below 6 or 8 inches because they grow very vertically, so a lot of their leaf area is in the top. And so if you chop that off, it really reduces the ability of the roots to continue to grow. All right. By the second year, the natives are big enough to compete well with other weeds. But if you need to, you can continue to spray broadleaf herbicide. And if the weeds that you encounter up here are palatable, you can start to graze at that point. If over the winter into the fall, the weeds or your natives have grown up big enough to where you have thatch cover left over, it's recommended that you burn in the spring to open up that canopy so they can get light as soon as possible and continue their growth. In the second season, you can start to graze as long as you don't stress those plants, below 8-10 inches, so they continue to grow, put energy into the roots and grow bigger and fill out more. I think I adjusted these dates kind of for you guys up here. However, I don't have a lot of experience up here, so you guys can tell that might be something that has a little bit of leeway. But you want to hay before early July or cease that grazing by mid-August. All right, so in summary, native grasses can have challenges during the establishment year, but with attention to detail and following the directions, you can easily have a good stand. They need a smooth, firm seed bed. They need to be seeded shallow, and you need to stay on top of your weed control. If you do so, natives will be a good tool in your toolbox. They are highly productive. After the establishment process, they are very low input, and very importantly, they are very drought tolerant. But if you cut corners during the establishment process, it will greatly reduce your success. All right, and Kaiser put a slightly different URL up, but this also leads you to the Native Grass College. So anything that I said that didn't make a lot of sense or whatever, you can go on there and find a more fleshed out version of that. But yeah, with that, I'd love to take any questions. Yeah.
Do you see any potential to establish big stands of cool season and warm season grasses?
So the question is, do I see any potential in mixing cool season and warm season grasses? That's an excellent question. That's not really anything that I've tried to do.
I worry that one would outcompete the other, and it might be that the cool seasons get going faster.
Yeah, so if there is a lot of overlap, the cool seasons could hinder the growth of the natives, and especially early on. Once they're established, though, the natives, they become they're bunch grasses, but they take up a lot of the space, and they can become. Kaiser, do you have a more
The long and short of
experienced
this,
answer to that?
I wouldn't try to mix them, because
Yeah.
it's like your instincts are telling you, is to particularly in establishment, you don't need them there, right? You need all that junk out of your way.
Yeah.
Has anybody here ever established alfalfa? Yeah? So you know how to establish native grasses in all honesty. Small seed, shallow seeding, intentional weed control. And so, you know, if you're going to establish alfalfa into an existing standard orchard grass, good luck, right? So you need to get all that filth out of your way, and I would not want the two together. Complicate management and get in the way of establishment.
And an even dumber part B to that question, you would never stick them in after the fact to try to seed them into an established stand either. You would never overseed warm season into a cool season pasture.
Correct. Yeah.
One of the dumbest stuff.
Yeah. If you want to put it that way, yeah, no, that would not work. They need the sunlight, they need the warmth during that establishment process. So, yes. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Her question was using a nurse crop along with these seeds, and so that's actually what a lot of my projects were during my PhD. And the answer is there is potential there. I've seen people, you know, attempt to do that and have their seedlings come up well. The trickiest thing there, though, which was the problem during my project, is you need to use a very light seeding rate, half or less what you normally would. And you need to really, really stay on top of grazing or removing that canopy. During that first season, you could graze off those nurse crops or cut them or whatever you need to do, but you really need to make sure they don't produce a canopy that blocks the warmth and the sunlight. So it's possible, but it takes pretty strict management. But that is a way to kind of reduce the downtime that those natives could have. Yes. A very wet environment. So the question is, how do you establish natives in a very wet environment? The answer is if it is sopping wet, it's going to be a little more difficult. Some of the species are, I think, well, eastern gamma grass can handle wet situations better than the others, but it doesn't work very well in a mix. So if you have very distinct areas, you could kind of pick and choose what you're going to plant. Big blue stem is fairly tolerant to moisture. I don't think it can handle anything swampy, but if you just get a lot of, wet after rain in an area, it does fine. Yeah.
Do you have any experience trying to get a stand established under organic practices without the herbicides?
Yeah, so a little bit. It's funny, I kind of joke about it. I came on from a kind of horticulture background, kind of a plant pathology background, and so I signed on to this PhD and I've loved every minute of it, but I joke that I don't have any experience. What I just told you up there is kind of academic. Most of my projects have been on abnormal, seeding methods of establishment. So yes, you can do it without herbicide. It's a lot more difficult because, you can use tillage, burning. Dr. Kaiser will get into management more. But yeah, burning, tillage, grazing, you just have to really aggressively use those to try to keep your weeds down. And it could take, instead of just like doing it the spring before, it could take multiple years of, getting your weeds under control in some situations. But it can be done.
Hey, Keagan, thank you so much. Appreciate you covering that topic for us. And, people will often ask me, well, Kaiser, you said all these great things. Well, I got to be over here, don't I? You tell us all these great things about native grasses. Well, they're all true. But what Keagan also told you is just as true, is that it can be challenging to establish them for all the reasons that he's outlined. And so you got to pay attention. And again, alfalfa is about the closest analogy I can think of for establishing natives. With that, let me talk. So we talked about maybe why we would do it. Keagan kind of addressed the hows to establish. I want to talk a little bit about the management of these grasses, how we deal with that. So, this is from some scanned pictures from a long time ago. This is big blue stem plants. These are switchgrass plants, and this is similar to a slide I showed you earlier, but a little different study. And what we see is that when we clip these plants real regularly, we reduce that root mass. So this is the same lesson that was learned in that 1955 study. But notice the difference there. We're talking about 4 and 5% of the mass of that root. That's pretty dramatic. And but here's the cool thing about this. This study was done in 1933, right? And with the exception of me, I don't think there's anybody here that was alive in 1933, was it? I wasn't really alive then. He knew that. He knew that. So that was a long time ago, folks. You know, I wish I could come up here and it would all be space age science. But you know, some of this stuff we have known for generations, right? And so the moral of the story here then is with native grasses, it's real simple. Don't beat them into the dirt. By the way, this is free. You know how you manage orchard grass? Don't beat it into the dirt, right? I mean, how do you manage tall fescue? Don't beat it into the dirt. How do you manage alfalfa? You get the idea. And speaking of orchard grass, my buddy Ray Smith, University of Kentucky, very simple little exercise. No root pictures. Sorry, I don't have that. But these are 2 potted orchard grass plants. One was cut to 1 inch residual height, 1 to 3.5 inch residual height, and this is 6 days later. Can anybody detect a difference between those 2 plants? Do you know what we recommend as the minimum height for managing orchard grass? Right, and it ain't 1 inch, okay? So this isn't something that just applies to native grasses, right? But that's rule number 1, don't beat them into the dirt. Okay, let's look at what rule number 2 might be. This is from a grazing study done out in the Great Plains by Bruce Anderson and his associates out in Nebraska. They grazed in 1982. Some switchgrass, 0.59 pounds a day, 127 pounds of gain per acre. Now, if you were paying attention to my earlier presentation, you might be thinking, oh, 0.5. Didn't Kaiser use a much bigger number than that? Didn't he tell us like 1.75? Why does this say 0.59? There's a reason for that, and I'm about to show it to you. Now, some of y'all are not old enough to know this, but back in the day, before PowerPoint, before digital cameras, there was these things called slides. Anybody ever heard of a slide? You willing to admit it? It was a little piece of cardboard for you young folks with this piece of film in the middle that you would put in front of a very bright light and it would show the picture, right? Well, these are old slides that have been scanned, and that's why that picture's so grainy. But not to despair. What you see is a steer, what you see is 2 more steers, and what you see is seed heads, and what you see is steers peering over very tall grass, okay? So what happened to Dr. Anderson and his colleagues is they underestimated the productivity of switchgrass and the rapid growth of switchgrass, and so they went out too light and too late, and the switchgrass got away from them, and again, another scientific term, it kicked their butts, okay? So, Bruce, pretty smart guy, and next year, ooh, does anybody remember the number I used for this? 1.74. Noble Foundation, you all may not be familiar with it, Oklahoma, did a bunch of forage research for decades. They did a very similar study, 1.75, almost eerie, right? And more importantly, I did something wrong. When we go from 0.5 to 1.76, we go from 127 pounds of gain per acre to 331 pounds per acre. And again, I'm going to do the math for y'all so you don't have to do it on your feet. We gained 200 extra pounds per acre. That's $400 right now, right? I don't know if anybody sold steers lately, but I'm going to call it maybe north of 400. Anybody sold steers lately? I don't know what y'all are getting up here, but we've been selling them for north of $2 in Tennessee, right? So that's $400 I just made per acre. It didn't cost me a nickel extra to get those extra $400. 161% improvement. So what happened? Did Bruce sprinkle fairy dust on his pastures? No. He learned his lessons from year 1. He got out there on time with more animals, and again, it's an old slide, he kept the stand vegetative. Rule number 1, don't beat them into the dirt. Rule number 2, keep it vegetative. It's kind of like driving, y'all. Keep it between the ditches. right? It's that simple. I wish I could complicate it more, but it really, truly is that simple. And this is just a little anecdote from a study we did in Tennessee to drive home this point about those extra 200 pounds. So these are 9-weight beef heifers, Angus herd, registered Angus herd, and 3 years of grazing, average daily gain. And so year 1, 0.4 something. Year 2, 1.6, and then about 1.5, let's say. So what happened? Same story I just told you about Bruce. We got educated by Eastern Game of Grass. But here's what I want you to really see from this. Here is our cost of gain over on this right axis with the green bar. Remember, that pasture cost me the same to get established and to own and to manage in every respect, whether I manage it poorly or whether I manage it well. And when I manage it poorly, I'm up to about 60 plus cents per pound gain, which actually is not a bad number. But when I manage it well, I'm down here below 30 cents a pound gain. Folks, it matters how you manage these grasses. Just because they have good inherent rates of gain doesn't mean they will always deliver that to you, right? So you can have sorry management and pay the price for it, or good management and reap the benefit of it, right? And so it really does translate into your pocket. So I said don't beat them into the dirt and don't let them go to seed, right? Keep it between the ditches. How do you do it? Well, the simple answer, as this picture I think illustrates, this is a lowland switchgrass stand in upper middle Tennessee, almost to the Kentucky border. June 23rd, 17 days previously, we got off it, a little over 2 weeks. We could easily, because of the stage of development of these grasses, stay off it another week or two before we started seeing seed heads trying to sneak in on us. So 4th of July in Tennessee, folks, we like hot and nasty in July in Tennessee. That's just the way we roll. Having that garden salad in front of you in midsummer in Tennessee, that's a pretty daggone good deal. And I suspect it's a good deal in upstate New York too. So how did we get there? Basically rotational grazing. And so rotational grazing will always be a good way to manage these grasses, plain and simple. You're not going to go wrong unless, I guess there's ways to go wrong, but the point is rotational grazing always works, it always works well, and it always coaxes some of the best production out of these grasses. So a little rule of thumb here, these are some recommended ranges of heights for these 3 forages based on rotational grazing. Now a couple things I want you to notice here. One, y'all ever heard the adage, take half, leave half? Is that okay? Y'all have that up here as well, right? And if you notice that, these are all kind of take half, leave halves, right? So that's the first thing I want you to see. Now, the high end of this is where you might enter it, right? And I wouldn't want to be much taller in any case than what you're seeing for those high ends, okay? Because if you're going to get beyond that, that stuff's going to begin to get away from you and you're going to start to get schooled again, okay? So you want to get in there for an entry right here. Now, early in the spring, you might want to go in a little lower, but when you come out, again, you want to leave some canopy there. Now, Keagan had used that 12-inch figure, which is fine in his presentation. You will often hear people talking about 8 inches for these grasses. In fact, that's probably the most widely cited figure out there is 8 inches. What I want to do is take that 8-inch figure and erase it from your brain, okay? Anybody ever see Men in Black? Yeah, you know, the little thing, you know, you wipe out the brain. I want to wipe that part of your brain out, right? I'm sorry, that was bad. And here's part of why I think that's so important. This is some data out of North Carolina, and this isn't switchgrass, weed occurrence. So here's your canopy, residual canopy, 21 inches, 16 inches, 10 inches. Look what's happening to your weed cover. In the Great Plains, where there's not a lot of cool season encroachment, where there may not be a lot of exotic grasses, you can get away physiologically with that 8-inch residual, and that's where that number comes from. That's a Great Plains number. Folks, we ain't in the Great Plains, okay? We've got rainfall here. We got up here encroaching cool season grasses down our way. We've got a lot of fun perennials that want to encroach, like Johnson grass and Bermuda grass, and once they're in there, by and large, you're not going to readily get them out without spending money, and in some cases, not even then. The point is this, is these grasses are going to stay more productive, more vigorous, and less weed infested if you think in terms of, I'll just round this off to 12 to 15 inches, okay? And you're going to be a whole lot happier over a whole lot longer period of time if you respect that minimum canopy height. So the 8-inch, gone forever. Never mention it again. Don't tell your wife, don't tell your girlfriend, don't tell your mother, don't tell your father, never talk about 8 inches, all right? Well, Rotational grazing between those two cut points, fairly easy, right? Well, we can make this even easier, okay? So this goes back to John Kreider's study from 1950. Anybody here alive in 1955 willing to admit it? Wow. Nope. I ain't saying nothing. I didn't say a thing. And I wasn't either, just for the, I know what you're thinking. No, I wasn't. Well, so what John Kreider did, God bless him, is he defoliated a bunch of plants, right? So he took off 10, 20, 30, 40 on up percent of the leaf surface area. And what he did is he measured the rate to change in root growth, right? What's interesting about this is once he hit 50% leaf area removed, have you all ever heard an old adage called take half, leave half? No, we already covered that, didn't we? And you have, and that's a good rule of thumb. Look here. If I get above 50% defoliation, look what happens to root growth. If I get up here to about 75, 80%, party's over. That plant is stalled out. Remember those roots I showed you? That was John Kreider's picture. Well, down here, the other half of the story, back to my buddy Paul Harvey, up to 50% defoliation, plant don't seem to care, which gave us an idea. Continuous grazing. So somebody asked me earlier, how do we do our grazing management? This was a study, and I've already alluded to this data once. These pastures were stocked in early May, and we came and got the steers long about Labor Day, okay? I don't know how you can make management easier. Open the gate May 10th, come back August 30th and get the steers. I don't know what you can do to make management easier than that, but that's what we did. This pasture, now we also had that where we had higher stocking early and then reduced it, shifted it. But that particular pasture was in its 99th day of continuous grazing on August 18th, 2016. The drought monitor was somewhere between D2 and D3. That's a drought-stricken pasture. Can you tell? No. You know why? Because it's a C4 grass with deep roots. Hadn't rained in weeks there. By the way, and I should have done it, but the rest of the farm was brown. Okay? When we got done with the trial that year, my farm manager came to me and said, hey, listen, I know your trial's over. I put the rest of my cattle down there. I said, no, you get the heck off my pasture. We're doing a research project here. You can't do that. But look at the rate of gain. Look at the pounds of beef per acre. Oh, forgot a little detail. That's a 2016 picture. No nitrogen since 2011. 0 pounds of nitrogen. That's called low input, y'all. If you can't open a gate on May 10th, and open it back up on August 25th, you ought not to be messing with cattle. I can't make it any easier than that, right? So because of John Kreider's principle, because we respected those canopy heights I just showed you, okay, we were able to pull this off. We did that for 3 summers in a row and went back and measured the stand, and you know what? We hadn't weakened it one bit. In fact, we might have, earlier question about grazing, we might have strengthened that stand, right? About as easy as it gets. So if you're going to manage continuously, those lower points, because the plant isn't getting that periodic rest under rotational, really ought to involve some higher low points and some lower high points, right? So we don't want it to get so mature because you're not fixing to come in there with a large number ahead to knock it back down. And here's the way I like to tell folks to do it. That handsome cowboy right there, if he can keep his native grasses at or below his hip, okay, the height of the canopy, and at or above the height of his boot all summer long throughout the growing season, he will never go wrong. So if you can remember that little cartoon right there, you now know what you need to know to manage grazing on native grasses. Our studies have shown you can do patch burn grazing, rotational grazes, continuous grazing, and a few other permutations. And at the end of the day, we get some fairly consistent rates of gain, and we're able to maintain vigorous stands. It's really that simple. And folks tend to want to complicate it and act like it's some kind of deep, dark mystery and hard to do. It's not. Heck, I do it. And I'm a fake cowboy. Well, what if you make a mistake, Kaiser? Well, we did. Here's a native grass pasture. I don't know if you can tell. Can y'all grow cucklebur up here? No? You don't grow cucklebur up here? Nasty, nasty plant. Bad spines stick to you. Broadleaf weed. That is in fact, one of the chemical companies drove past, this is one of our research farms, drove past there. They turned around and came back, found the research farm director and said, hey, we got a new chemical we're trying to put on the market and we are trying to test it on cucklebur. Can we use your field? That is a true story. That is a true story. So what was this? This is a big blue stem Indian grass field into the growing season that had been abused for about 3 years in a row. The farm manager had grazed it down. It wasn't an experiment anymore. He grazed it down to about 4 inches. I guess he thought it was orchard grass. And that's what we had. Now, one thing I want you to notice is there's a bunch of seed heads scattered out there. They may not show up real well in that picture, but there are native grass plants out there. But instead of heavy, vigorous, prolific native grass plants, these were small. They were down to 1 or 2 tillers per plant, maybe 3 tillers per plant. They were weakened plants, and we had just a minimal population of them. What did we do? We rested it. Look here, September, August, 2018, 2017. We rested it for a year. Now, that is an extremely abused pasture. We rested it for 1 year, and look what it did. It's back to a large extent. One other thing we did, I'll slip this picture in between, we burned it in March of 2018. That's a pretty good looking stand of native grasses. The key is we caught it before our plant population deteriorated. The plants themselves got very, very weak. They went from having 30, 40, 50, literally 100 tillers per plant, big, vigorous plants, down to these weak plants with a couple, 3 tillers left that were about to die out, right? Because too much competition, too much grazing. My point is this, is there's a lot of people I meet that start off grazing native grasses, they tend to approach it as if they had some rare, fragile, 1,000-year-old Chinese vase in their hands. Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm going to break it. Oh, I'm just terrified. You ain't going to break it, okay? You can slam this stuff into a ditch, okay, as hard as you possibly can, and you're going to be okay. What you can't do is keep slamming it into a ditch as hard as you can, because then it will go away. Okay, so if you make a mistake, don't fret over it. The cure for the mistake is real simple. I used a 5-letter word to talk about soil health, R-O-O-T-S. Well, there's a 4-letter word that takes care of all these problems. It's called R-E-S-T, right? That's how we deal with problems with native grasses. Now, when you introduce a lot of weed pressure by severe grazing, depending on what that weed is, you may need to do some kind of intervention. I don't know, we're working with some organic or organic style farm environments, and so people aren't going to be in a hurry to use herbicides. That problem can be taken care of with 2,4-D, okay? So there are things we can do to clean these weeds up, but understand, once you open the door and they come in, unless you do some kind of remediation, either through changing your management or addressing the weeds directly, you're going to have a problem. The good news is that stand there is going to preclude a lot of annuals, but if some of these come in as perennials in that situation, they're not going to go away that easily, okay? But just understand, rest can cure a multitude of ills. So, gentleman asked about fire, and I just mentioned fire in passing in the previous slide. These grasses are highly fire adapted. They love fire, okay? And fire is an excellent tool to manage these grasses. So, look at this. This is in East Tennessee. A big bluestem Indian grass pasture that was recently burned. What you see is uniform, vigorous growth. You got some gaps in the stand here, but what I wanted you to be able to see here is that the thatch is gone. We've got exposed mineral soil, right? And what that means is the sun is hitting that mineral soil, and the sun is turning these grasses loose because that sun is hitting that root collar. So the reason people have burned these grasses for thousands of years, Native Americans before us and us now, is that fire does several things for us. It eliminates the thatch, it eliminates the old growth, and it allows the soil to heat up more. And remember, these are warm season grasses. They want sunlight, they want heat. They want the kind of weather that you don't want, right? 95 degrees and humid, that's what they want, right? That's their happy place. So by burning, I'm exposing that soil to that sunlight, and I'm allowing that plant to break dormancy 1, 2, 3 weeks earlier in the spring than it otherwise would, which means that in that growing season, I'm going to increase yield. And the other happy thing that happens, and again, I don't have a framework of comparison here in this particular picture, but that's a pretty green right there, okay? And what I've done is I've turned loose a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus into that soil by the act of burning, and that plant is taking it up. So those plants actually have higher crude protein as if you had fertilized them by about 2 or 3% than an equally similar stand that had not been burned, okay? And in fact, if I turned cattle loose, if I put a fire line right down through there and I burned this half and not that half, and then turned the cattle loose, where would the cattle be? From the day I turned them into that pasture, where would they be? On the burn side. And If I had a 1,000-acre pasture out in the Great Plains and I'd burned 100 acres, you know where the cattle would be? They would find that 100 acres, and that's where they would be. If I went into that same pasture, 1,000-acre pasture, I'd burned it in April, they would find that portion that was burned, and if I went in August, or July rather, and burned another little piece, which you can actually do in the Great Plains because there's some dry grass out there, they would then move from the April burn to the July burn. They will follow that fire all over that pasture because the grass has been improved. So the question is, should I burn my native grass pasture? Simple answer, heck yeah, burn it. But there's a corollary question to that. Do I have to use fire to have native grasses? Answer, absolutely not. Our family owns a quarter section of native range out in the Great Plains, and those people in that particular part of the Great Plains don't burn, hadn't been burned in 3 generations. And it's still a very productive, very healthy native grassland. Would it benefit from a burn? Absolutely. So what I would tell you is, don't let burning scare you away from growing native grasses as a forage resource, that tool in the toolbox. But if you are able to burn, or you're naturally a pyromaniac, I'm trying to pick out a pyro, and I ain't calling names, but I think I see one out there. Then yes, you should burn it. And one little detail, if you're trying to encourage the growth of the grasses, you may not be able to see it here real well, but there is a little emerging shoot from a native grass plant about 3-4 inches long. When you see that in the spring, that's your sign. It's time to go find a drip torch, okay? That is when you want to burn to promote native grasses, not really at any other time of the year. And by the way, these native grasses, if you've ever been around to, say, a switchgrass stand that's been sitting there for an entire growing season, maybe 2 growing seasons, and you light a match in it, I promise you, you will be the first person that next Sunday morning at opening up the door of the Sunday school. You will have the fear of God put into you. I promise you. It's like a bomb going off. It terrifies people. 30, 40, 50-foot flame lengths. I mean, it's the craziest thing you ever saw. You can't get within 100 feet of it. So that terrifies people. Say, well, I don't want to burn it. What I want to impress on you is when you have a grazed native grass stand and it hasn't sat there idle for a year or 2, that's the kind of fire you're talking about. It kind of creeps around out there. You might get to a place with a little more fuel and it'll flare up on you. But the point is, it's not a conflagration. Put another way, with a little bit of common sense and attention to detail, you can do this at home, right? So fire, did I answer your question? It's a tool that's well adapted to the grass, but not essential. So, all right, fertility. This is from a trial we did in East Tennessee, and it lines with everybody else's data. This big blue stem and switchgrass. The big blue stem yield was always a little bit less than the switchgrass, but that's not the real lesson here. The real lesson is that regardless of how much phosphorus we put out there, those bars never materially changed height. Put another way, native grasses don't really care about how much phosphorus you put in the ground. They do very well in low phosphorus soils. Did I mention they're adapted to North American conditions and poor soil fertility environments, okay? You don't need to do phosphorus amendment to grow native grasses. If you're cutting hay, pay attention to your phosphorus level. Do your soil tests so you don't mine phosphorus out of the ground. But if you're worried about yield, it's completely unnecessary. And as long as you're monitoring your soil phosphorus levels, you could ignore the amendments as long as that's not going in the wrong direction. Potassium, statistically, we found a difference between 0 and 275. Anybody want to put 275 pounds of K2O out there? Not worth it. Put another way, as a practical matter, there is no yield response to potassium. Again, a finding corroborated by many other studies. This isn't just us. Keagan mentioned this for establishment. We had a very accomplished soil scientist at the University of Tennessee doing some research on switchgrass. After looking at pH levels, he came out with a recommendation of 5.0 or better. You don't need to amend. He went on to tell me in a private meeting that they didn't even see a difference down to 4.5. So I said, well, why didn't you put 4.5 in the recommendation? He laughed at me. He said, Pat, nobody would believe me. They'd think I'd lost my mind. These grasses, and there's other research out there that corroborates it. Keagan did a greenhouse study. One of the things, he didn't have enough work to do, so he asked me, can I do more and more projects, Dr. Kaiser? Can you load me up heavier? And so he volunteered to do a study in the greenhouse where we took native soil, field soil, not greenhouse pot and plant material, and adjusted the pH down to what, 4 or 5? And now this is seedlings. No different, statistical difference in the seedlings growing at 4.5 or 6.0. But we've also seen the same thing with the mature plants. They're fine in acidic soils, y'all. They're fine with low levels of potassium, low levels of phosphorus. Remember I told you low input, okay? But here's one wrinkle to the low input story. Boom, nitrogen, okay? So here's big blue stem switchgrass and eastern gamma grass. Those are our nitrogen rates right there, and that's our yield. See a pretty clear pattern, right? No question about it. And by the way, from a statistical standpoint, once we reached 120 units, there's no statistical difference in the yields anywhere to the right of that. So 180, 240, even 360 statistically is no different than 120. Put another way is any nitrogen you add above 120 is a waste of your time and money, okay? Up to 120, you can probably get some pretty decent yield bumps, but take into account the cost of your nitrogen, right? And so our standard recommendation, well, it comes in two ways. If you're not really pressed for forage, you're not really trying to push productivity, 60 units is fine. If you're really trying to push productivity, maybe you got more animals than you have acres and you're really trying to keep your bites up, you know, lots of bites of forage, then that 120 can certainly be worth it if your cost of nitrogen isn't too high, right? But so yes, native grasses can do well in low fertility environments, but they do respond to nitrogen up to about 120 units per acre, with 60 probably being optimal. One of the things we're going to do now is we're going to push this through an economic analysis, and I strongly suspect the economic optimum is going to be between 60 and 120. It's not going to be 120. So let me summarize this management stuff. It requires more management than a lot of other forages, more sensitive to defoliation, and it's very resilient to mismanagement. Like I say, you can slam this stuff into the wall. You just can't do it consistently, right? If that's your normal mode of operation, you're not going to have native grasses but for so long. So I like to throw this in here because, again, I've often heard this mantra that native grasses are so hard to manage. So we're going to take a little exam here. I'm not going to let you all off the hook, okay? Pikes Peak, Colorado. Anybody ever been there? I did not. I know these buff-looking studs look a lot like me. But what I have to confess is, A, that's not me, and B, I drove up there. Ford Motor Company took me to the top, 14,000 feet. I also got another confession to make. When I got out of that truck and took about 3 steps, I almost fell over. There wasn't no oxygen up there. I'm just telling you. That's just me. All right. That's Mount Lacotte. That is a mountain in the Smoky Mountains, and it is the highest relief, not the highest elevation of any mountain in the eastern United States. I'd had my knee surgery, and I went up there with my 2 sons, and I made it. I'm not going back up, though. I did it once, though. I can brag, and I can show you the dang picture, okay? That was a workout. That was a workout. This is a hill. And this is my son and his bride floating down the Shenandoah River, which has a gradient of about a drop of 6 feet per mile. Put another way, you don't have to paddle. You can steer the canoe, but you don't have to paddle. So, absolutely no effort, some effort, pretty hard, Superman. Which one of those, this is your test question, most closely resembles the difficulty of establishing and managing native grasses? Any guesses? What's that? I heard a C. Do I hear an A or a B or a D? Well, the gentleman here gets a free prize. You're entitled to a signed copy of the book, okay? See, truth, he already has a signed copy of the book. But the reality is, yeah, you know on a warm summer day if you hiked up that hill, okay? You'd break a sweat. Going through this drain right here, you might go through some briars, you might stub your toe, you might hit some poison ivy. I'm not saying it's child's play and it's easy, but I'm saying it don't take Superman, it don't even take Mr. Stud Muffin himself after his knee surgery, but it for sure ain't floating down the river, right? If that's what you want farming to be, I got a little news flash for you, okay? So the point, you can do this at home, okay? If you pay attention to details. Keagan stressed that for establishing small seeded plant, and really on the management side, if you can figure out where your hip and the top of your boot are, you're halfway there, right? So we're back to my 100-degree heat index pasture and cattle grazing in midday, right? So that is management of native grasses, right? We talked about fire, fertility, different ways to graze. Questions about any of that? Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a great question. So what we have found for the big blue stem and Indian grass, those blends, which you can see we've done a lot of research on that, we're typically running about 800, 900 pounds per acre, maybe 1,000. But I showed you that Kentucky strip bench. That was about 250. So it takes a little bit of experience to kind of figure out where you need to be. We did one grazing study on some soils that should have been growing grain. I mean, it was some really good soil, high quality soil, and we were doing maybe 1,200 pounds on this stuff. So I don't know what your pastures are like up here and your inherent productivity. If it were me, I might start off with about 800 pounds per acre and just see what the heck happened. And if you've got another pasture to go to, which I'm sure you do, if it's like, wow, that didn't last long, well, you come out and let it regrow, right? But that's my starting point. The switch grasses is going to be probably 25% higher, and the gamma grass might be just a tad below the switch grass. And I say 25, may even be 30% higher, 35, 40% higher. Switchgrass definitely higher carrying capacity. Yes, sir.
What would the feed value of that protein and energy would it be like that?
What is the feed value of that grass right there in terms of protein and energy? That grass right there is probably running about 9% crude protein, and it's running probably about 60, I'm going to say 60% TDN. Not impressive numbers, right? They're not like, oh boy, I need some of that. But the point is that they're performing really well on it. Yes, ma'am. What about what? Yeah, so the NDF on that is going to be running probably right there, mid-60s. And again, you're not like, well, that's, what are you trying to convince me this is good, right? But the point is, remember, animal performance is showing up every time we do these, right? It's consistently showing up. Yeah.
So, you're trying to reduce warming and chemical inputs into your livestock themselves. Management intensive grazing, often sort of the golden standard is like, don't come back for 30 days. Do you feel like you can keep the forage in good palatable range if you're not coming back for 30 days?
In a word, no. These grasses grow. Yeah, I'm sorry. So the question is, if you were to have a 30-day rest period on these grasses, would they remain palatable, right? And the short answer is no. If it's particularly dry, if you've knocked them pretty hard, if maybe you don't have a real productive site, yeah. Or late summer, you might be able to get away with that. From May 1, and I'm using Tennessee dates, it'd be later up here, but from May 1 to June 30, ain't no way in the world. Now, one of the things we're fixing to start a study on sheep. I mentioned the sheep killing study. Just settle down. But we're going to do another study with sheep that a guy is interested in seeing is, so part of the issue with those parasites, right, is if you get down low, you're ingesting the larva, right? So remember these heights I told you, 13, 14, 15, 16 inches? What we're going to do is we're going to graze sheep on here and use those heights, and our control is going to be a cool season fescue-dominated pasture. We graze it to 4 inches, which is our traditional recommendation. And one of the things we're guessing is that maybe if that parasite larva only gets up here and my canopy's up here, maybe I don't need that long rest period. And when people talk about these really long rest periods under regenerative grazing, keep in mind that ought to be a function of how heavily you've used that pasture, right? So if you take half, leave half. Look at Kreider's data. You haven't touched the roots, right? And so I've heard people say 70-day rest periods. I've heard 42-day rest periods. I think for these grasses, depending on site productivity and all those other things, 2 weeks, max of 4, which is getting close to your 30 days, but that would be the max. I would be getting really nervous if someone told me, yeah, I'm going to wait 30, 40, 50 days. I think you're backing up. That's a great question. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
Can you mix these grasses with legumes to help supply some of that extra nitrogen, or are they really just better?
Yeah, so the question is, can you mix these grasses with legumes to supply nitrogen? The answer is yes, and we've done studies. Y'all know, I don't know what y'all call them up here, beggar's ticks, beggar's lice, the little triangle things that stick to your britches. Do they grow up here? Y'all staring at me like you don't know what I'm talking about. They grow up here, okay? Quail hunters love them, right? So that is a native legume that grows really well with these grasses, and cattle love. They'll graze the heck out of that stuff. We've used red clover. Alfalfa will actually work. White clover, because it's down low, can work. So we can get legumes in here. But what's interesting is we did a study early on where we compared grazing performance with and without legumes. And other than costing us more time and money to put the legumes in there, we saw no difference in animal performance, grazing days, or pounds of beef per acre. And part of the reason is a lot of our cool season legumes, when they're growing really well, is the same time that these grasses are kicking out these 2.5 to 3 pound a day rates of gain. What the heck's the clover going to do for you, right? And we didn't see an advantage. So I'd say no problem in doing it, but don't feel like it's essential. Kind of like fire, right? Yeah.
Was that the difference you didn't see? Was that you didn't see a difference in animal gain or in gain per acre?
Either one. Either one. Because again, the peak of that happened to be red clover. That maybe be different with some other forage legume. But the peak of when that legume was available corresponded to the peak productivity of that grass. And then later in the summer, the red clover was played out. You know, in August, we weren't finding red clover, so it wasn't contributing anything then. So I still think it's a good idea. I think there's all kinds of reasons for plant diversity in a pasture. So I'm not against the legumes. I'm just pointing out that if you feel like, man, I really got to add these because it's not complete without it, I'm not seeing it in terms of data. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So we got one last section, and it has to do with wildlife, because a lot of people are interested in wildlife conservation, and these native grasses often are part of that conversation. So let me dive into that. What I'm going to be doing is laying a little bit of groundwork, maybe more so than talking about nuts and bolts like we've been talking about with establishment and grazing management. And so these are 4 species of birds, grassland-associated birds: grasshopper, sparrow, field sparrow, eastern meadowlark, northern bobwhite. I'm hoping you've at least heard of all those species. This is data from the USGS that they have, for the past 50 years, run these routes where they monitor bird populations. What you need to know about these maps is that red is bad, okay? So the parts of the range for those species where the population has declined has been painted red on these maps. That ought to tell you a story. Total population loss during that 50-year period, you can see, is pretty daggone dramatic. Bobwhite takes the cake at 86%. So we've got 14% of the population today that we had 50 years ago for these species, okay? In other words, they are dropping, right? And the other interesting thing, or discouraging thing, is the rate of decline has been fairly consistent over that period, right? It's not like they declined a long time ago and they've been stable ever since. These things have been declining for 50 years across most of their range. And here's a paper, and actually this came out of Cornell University right here in New York, Ken Rosenberg and his associates. And they did this large-scale analysis of bird trends, and they grouped birds into different categories of where they like to live. Like wetland birds are doing pretty well, ducks and such. Grassland birds, terrible. So it's not just those 4 species, but it's those 4 species across most of their ranges for 50 years, and it's basically all grassland birds. They are having a hard time. And I don't know if a lot of people realize that. I've often said if this was visible to people from a biological standpoint, this is sort of like a bird dust bowl, okay? This is a big deal. And of course, the underlying problem is that we have lost most of our grasslands, including here in the eastern United States. And I feel like I need to pause for a second here, because people think, well, wait, Kaiser, there are no grasslands in the eastern United States. Never were, never has been. Well, let me correct that perspective. If we look at pollen samples, people will core the sediment in the bottom of a pond and look at the carbon samples, and they can be several thousand years old, those profiles. Charcoal deposits in the soil, something called dendrochronology. So you take the rings of trees and we can recreate fire histories. All 3 lines of evidence, plus a 4th line of evidence, the descriptions by early explorers, okay? We also have that. And by the way, some of the survey data from early on gives us information too. The notes taken by surveyors, all of which point to the fact that much of the eastern United States was probably, everything you see here was open canopy forest. Not necessarily wide open prairies, although here in western Kentucky and Tennessee we had about a 3 million acre prairie. Down here in Alabama, Mississippi, we had about a 500,000 acre prairie. But there's all kinds of lines of evidence that indicate that these forests were overwhelmingly open canopied forests that were burned under. Let me give you just one anecdote. Up here is Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts. In 1633, a guy sailing the coast of eastern Massachusetts, an English explorer, described the forests in the area. He said they were wide open and you could not find any good timber. 3 years later, another English explorer was sailing the Chesapeake Bay. His characterization of the forest was almost identical, except he added the fun little detail that you could drive a 4-horse chariot through the woods easily. These were open forests. And when we look at the declining bird species, I don't have the time to get in there and unpack it. It's pretty obvious that they were birds that were associated with open forest canopies. So somebody asked, I believe it was you, Pierre, about silvopasture. If those early accounts are anything to go by, we had a world of silvopasture in the eastern United States, okay? And anyway, I could go on and on about the evidence that reinforces that, but the Hudson Valley would not have been immune to that scenario. And consequently, what we have is the relict grasslands in the eastern United States, and really almost globally for grasslands, are some of the most imperiled ecosystems on the planet. So it shouldn't surprise us that these grassland birds are in the tank like they are. Well, one other thing that's really important when we're talking about the sort of 10,000-foot view of this whole conservation questions is grasslands are more than the pieces parts, okay? It's not just having an absence or suppression of the exotic vegetation and dominance of native vegetation. It's also the appropriate disturbance, okay? So anywhere on this planet that you have naturally occurring grasslands, there is a reason for it. Part of that is rainfall patterns, but the other part is the disturbance patterns that come along, okay? And so here in eastern United States, we're depending on where you are in the eastern United States. Tennessee, very typically low 50s would cover a lot of the state in terms of precipitation. I don't know about, I guess this summer it's been probably about 100 inches, right? But, you know, I don't know what your long-term average is, but I want to show you an eastern grassland without disturbance. You recognize that? It's called a forest. And I promise you, every piece of original grassland in the eastern United States that hasn't been maintained by an appropriate disturbance now looks like that. I guarantee it. Now, what we know is that fire, we've already talked about this, is an ecologically normal component of our grasslands in North America. It is part and parcel of these grasslands. And most conservationists that I've ever met, wildlife biologists, are inherently pyromaniacs. They love fire, and you don't have to convince them they ought to go out and burn something, okay? But that's not the whole story for North American grasslands. So, but it's an important part, and this is another kind of fun map. So Dan Day with the U.S. Forest Service out in Missouri put this map together, kind of a forecast of historical fire intervals. And you notice much of the southern United States and what we refer to as the fescue belt in here burn pretty daggone regularly. But notice this little Hudson Valley y'alls and Champlain Valley. That's painted the same color out here as a lot of the northern plains. In other words, based on the data he was able to bring together, fire was absolutely a part of the ecology and history of this part of the world. Granted, it was less frequent. Well, so fire, sure enough. What about this thing called herbivory? You know, we used to have about 50 million bison, as some estimates, that used to roam the Great Plains. And that picture I took in the Osage Hills of Oklahoma on a TNC preserve, where they are burning the prairie and letting the bison run around to the burn patches like I talked about, the patch burn grazing. And what we are learning is that pattern of fire and herbivory is about as natural as you can get for North American grasslands. Now, let me focus then on this herbivory a little bit, because most conservationists and wildlife biologists think that cattle are the bane of the earth, okay? I'm about to tell you they couldn't be more wrong, all right? And I mentioned earlier, someone asked about the roots and grazing. Grazing improves the root structure, improves the carbon storage. Well, guess what else grazing does? It helps the wildlife if done properly. So let's talk about this for a few minutes. This is a square mile in Missouri, southwestern Missouri. These quarter sections, you can see this is from 2014, okay? So this was grazed the year before, grazed the year before, grazed the year before, not grazed the year before, okay? All those little dots you see out there are telemetry locations from northern bobwhite quail. You notice a pattern? Lots of quail use, lots of quail use, lots of quail use, a great big donut hole in this ungrazed patch. By the way, this area had been burned the previous fall. Quail like that. They like fire. Remember we said fire and grazing are natural disturbance factors in North America? All right, we're gonna step forward to 2015. And by the way, in 2014, all of this was being grazed. It just had not been grazed the year before, okay? So here we go to 2015. The burned area has grown back up, the quail have abandoned it. But notice what they've done. They're still using over here, they're still using over here, but now they've gone into the donut hole. The moral of the story is, without grazing, native grasses are not good habitat for northern bobwhite quail. With grazing, they use them. Let me show you just how strong that pattern is. 50% of the nests were on 20% of the acreage, okay? So in other words, the 20% of the site that was grazed had 50% of the nest. Very strong selection in favor of grazed areas. And the nest success was twice as high where there was a history of grazing than where there wasn't grazing, okay? Take home message is, I get more nests, I get more successful nests, and therefore more quail chicks where there has been a history of grazing than when I, quote, protect it, okay? So we absolutely want that grazing. But you know, earlier I showed you a slide that showed that eastern meadowlark and grasshopper sparrow are in long-term serious declines. Well, the same pattern that benefited the quail benefited both of those species. And by the way, this is a piece of property owned by the Missouri Department of Conservation. They have been spending about $112 an acre per year, they had calculated, trying to manage properties for quail. And by the way, that's an old number, so it's probably 150 now. Grazing, they were making money. People were paying them to graze the pastures, okay? So this working lands concept, which is what this is often referred to, is we're not throwing the cattle out. We're figuring out how to make the cattle and the quail and the eastern meadowlark and the grasshopper sparrow play nicely together, okay? Now that's in Missouri. So we got excited, and in Kentucky, we did a very similar study. So this right here is native grass pasture that's being grazed. This is tall fescue pasture, likewise being grazed. And all the little dots, once again, are quail use areas. You see a pattern? Lots of dots, middle of the pasture. Heck, I've walked those pastures. Over here's, you know, 3 or 4 mamas grazing, and over here's a pair of quail flushing because I'm walking towards them, okay? Same pasture, quail and cattle getting along together. Over here, find me a dot. And by the way, that's just the border of the field, that's dashed lines. They ain't there. They don't use that. And the difference is the vegetative structure of those tall growing native grasses. And remember we talked about managing them from the top of my boot to my hip? Well, we were managing these native grasses because it was continuous grazing. We weren't bothering the producers to move cattle around to stick them out there and come back and get them in the fall. We were managing them kind of calf high. Quail were happy there, okay? One other study, just to prove it's not just quail, in Missouri showed the same thing. So again, grasshopper sparrow, in this case field sparrow. These are fescue pastures. You see the grasshopper sparrow on the bottom, field sparrow on the top, and this is number of fledglings that were being fledged per year per acre, a hectare, but same difference. Native grass, what is that, about 4 times, 5 times as many? But just like with grazing, for profit and for beef, management matters. Remember that study I told you about where we did continuous grazing, opened the gate on May 5th, 10th, whatever it was, came and got them at the end of the summer. And the other treatment was where we stocked heavy in the spring, and midsummer we pulled out animals. The net effect was our canopies were a lot lower here. So that extra canopy height, we're not talking about a dramatic difference. We're talking about 14 versus 18 inches. And look at the number of birds that we're producing there versus in tall fescue. I can have my cake and eat it too. The key to it is having native grasses that are grazed properly. And maybe I should start off saying are grazed and grazed properly, right? But even if I graze them more aggressively, like you see here, I'm still doing better. Even here is some very weak advantage over that. but right here I really do it. And interestingly enough, and I'm not going to show you all the facts and figures, but our analyses show us that a lot of this density and nest success has everything in the world to do with canopy height. Those taller canopies really matter, and this bears it out right there. So we can have our cake and eat it too. We can benefit these species that are declining all over their ranges in North America by having a combination of native grasses and grazing. And by the way, none of this virtually included fire. That wasn't part of the picture. So that cow alone can save our grassland birds that are declining by judicious grazing of native grasses. Fire would help, but we can do it with cattle alone. Cattle are our friends, not our enemies. Private landowners own all the grass in the eastern United States, and most private landowners at a minimum have to pay taxes. Maybe some of them are trying to make a living, maybe some of them are trying to send a kid to college, but that's where this working lands comes in, right? We need some market-based incentives. You got to make a little bit of money. And setting the farm aside to help birds is not an option for most people. And remember, it's not just having the natives there, it's having these fellas here as part of the picture. We got to have them. We got to have our disturbance, okay? So that is it for the wildlife section, and it's actually it for the whole presentation. Questions about the wildlife component? And we can also talk about anything that's been brought up this evening, but I want to at least give you a chance to ask some questions about the wildlife management side of this, or conservation. Yes, ma'am.
So one of my questions about this particular thing is the thing I'm kind of most interested in actually, is how do you integrate, I mean, do you have any success stories or any studies that really sort of integrating?
Yeah, so the question, and I'm going to try and encapsulate it for our friends inside the little box here, but have we seen success stories of a grassland working lands model, right? Particularly with conservation organizations. The thing that encourages me is that I feel like we are getting more and more people to recognize the importance of this. And so if there was like a land trust, I don't know, operating in, let's just make something up, New England as an example, that had some farmland and was trying to do something for conservation, I think this would be a really good idea. Just saying, Alejandro. This would be a really good idea. But I think the other thing too is help, and part of the reason I started with that 10,000 foot view about these declines in birds and grassland birds is this idea that these twin devils, that we were always a primeval, dense, dark forest in this part of the world. There's never been anything else. It's nonsense, number one. And number two, if you'll recall that slide, forest birds are really doing pretty well. You know, there's a few species that are declining, and interestingly enough, there's species that probably need a little more disturbance in the forest, like a fire to run through them from time to time. The grassland birds is where we really ought to be focused for conservation, and grasslands in general. And so, and going back to this soil health thing and what I talked about carbon, if all this climate smart agriculture is ever going to mean anything, the way it's going to mean something is because of grasslands. And not just grasslands that you smile at across the fence, but that cattle are wandering across that you're managing. That is going to be the solution to climate-friendly agriculture in this country. And it's also going to be the solution to conserving at-risk bird populations and pollinators. One thing we hadn't gotten into, and I showed you a couple pictures but didn't explain them, we got these fields, I said you don't need the legumes. We've got these fields slammed full of flowers, native flowers, and pollinators everywhere. So a lot of conservation solutions can come out of this, and getting these organizations all to sing off the same sheet of music so landowners are hearing a consistent message, I think is very important. But I think we are moving more and more in that direction. So, other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, what is patch burn grazing? So patch burn grazing, when I showed you that picture of the buffalo, so what that is that a patch of a pasture would be burned each year, and you would rotate where that burn occurs in that pasture. So keep in mind, out in the Great Plains where they've kind of developed a lot of these ideas, that they have square mile pastures, right? And so they might burn a quarter of it or a third of it each year, and they move around what's burned, and so that's the patch that's being burned. And as I mentioned to you, the cattle and the buffalo follow the burn. And so they will move around. So it's like rotational grazing where the intervals aren't days or weeks, but are years. So year one, you got burn, patch one, animals suck in on it, spend 70% of their time there. And by the way, remember that technical term I used earlier, beat the tar out of? They beat the tar out of it, but because you burn a new patch the next year, those animals pick up and move to the new patch the second year, and still will graze the old patch somewhat, but they largely leave it alone. And the third year, they completely leave it alone. So after 3 years, it's had enough rest to build back up and looks a lot like an ungrazed pasture in terms of the dominance of tall grasses. And so it goes round and round. And so one source of water, one set of fencing, no moving cattle, but you're getting somewhat the effect of rotational grazing by using the fire. Now, the headache is you've got to put in the burn, right? And the beauty of it is it's more advantageous for a lot of native birds and so forth. It doesn't give you any advantage in terms of gain per acre. It actually is a wash, but the point is you don't lose anything, right? So that's patch burn grazing in 90 seconds. Yeah, so the question is burning economical? Do you get enough gain out of it to justify the cost? That depends on how much it costs you to burn. I heard a conversation earlier talking about some very expensive burns. Places like in the Kansas Flint Hills where they burn every year, the farmers do all their own burning. And my guess is that they probably are burning at a cost of no more than $10 or $15 an acre, and probably not even that much. And at that price, yes, they're clearly getting an economic advantage, no question. But if you're starting to pay other people to burn and spending a lot of money on it, there's going to be a point of diminishing returns. I've never seen that threshold calculated, you know, how many dollars an acre, but certainly at $10 or $15 an acre, you're making money. So, other questions, wildlife, or anything else? Any lie you've been told this evening? Alejandro. Okay, so the question is, why does previous year's grazing influence current patterns of use, right? What's the legacy effect? The answer to that is that the cattle create trails through the pasture that are really important, little micro features out there. They reduce the amount of thatch out there and kind of make the stand a little more irregular, all of which benefit the critters. And the kind of the flip side of that is that these native grasses, where you get, like in southwest Missouri where that study occurred, about 38 inches of rain a year, these tall growing grasses basically get too rank and too tall to be of value, right? And so some of that legacy of that thick, heavy mess out there is kind of in their way. And what we really think is true for virtually all these grassland associated birds is we really want a canopy that's sort of 16 to 24 inches tall, that has a fair amount of openness and moderate amount of thatch at the ground level, all things that are created by grazing. So I think that's what kind of characterizes that legacy effect, is just that rank mess that's left behind. Another question? One over here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so the question is the things that contribute to the grassland drought, burning, grazing, right? And talking a little bit more about the drought. And so maybe rather than talking about drought per se, what we would say is that where rainfall is less, grasslands become more dominant, where it's generally too dry for trees. And remember, a tree takes, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years to grow. So if you have a drought event, if your baseline is 30 inches of rain, you're kind of stressing when that tree can grow. But their drought, I mean, Oklahoma droughts and Tennessee and New York droughts are two different animals, right? An Oklahoma drought will stop trees in their track from coming into the grassland. They're not going to be able to recruit. The other thing drought does is it creates a whole lot more dry fuel that can result in some fairly severe fires that will really, and again, I keep using all these high-powered scientific terms, what will put a hurting on the hardwoods, right, and the trees that are trying to encroach. When you get some of the kind of fires that they can have out there, those hardwoods will not survive, right? And so that drought cycle creates also these intense fire cycles, but it also suppresses recruitment because it's too dry. So that's kind of how drought kind of contributes to grassland remaining grasslands. And I don't know if that was really your question or not, but that's what I thought you were asking.
Well, do droughts also contribute, I mean, in your studies, to greater productivity versus other grasses?
So the question being, do droughts contribute to greater productivity? And you also said compared to other grasses, right? And so what we would see is in any given level of drought, the C4 deep-rooted grasses would tend to either maintain, you could have enough drought that it drops off. I've got a slide I didn't include tonight that showed a fairly substantial drop off in a severe drought, but that substantial drought was on switchgrass, the driest summer, one of the driest summers ever recorded in Tennessee, and the yield dropped off that year down to 5 tons per acre. Driest summer almost in Tennessee, and it dropped to 5 tons per acre. That was for switchgrass. It had been 8 and 9 tons in that particular site. So it will drop in the face of severe drought, no question about it. But your cool seasons would go down to very, very little, right? So that would be the relative comparison in drought. As far as a lot of data on that, no, we don't have it because we can't plan for droughts, right? In fact, we did a drought grazing study, and I showed you one slide that was from it. We did it at 2 different locations over 3 summers. You know how many weeks of drought we had during those 3 summers at 2 locations? About 2. It rained all summer, every summer at both sites. That was our drought study. So go figure, right? Murphy. One last, yeah, Keagan.
If a producer is looking to introduce native grasses, is there a recommendation for how much land you think they should start with or build up to?
Yeah, yeah. So the question was, how much of your farm should you put into this, especially to start with, right? And so here's what I would tell you is, where I would start is the sorriest field on your farm, right? So I talked about marginal sites. Stop and think about it. If you take a really marginal site on your farm and you take it out of production for a summer to plant this stuff, how much are you really missing? Answer, not much. New ground, like Keagan talked about, well, it hadn't been producing forage anyway, so it's not hurting your forage production program to put it in. So I look for marginal sites. A third option would be sites that are, you know you need to renovate. That pasture's had the stew beat out of it. It's in terrible shape. It's not productive anymore. I got to renovate it. So you're going to go spend money renovating it anyway. So maybe you're going to spend a little more to renovate it back to natives, but that marginal difference is a lot smaller than starting from scratch. So the point is, I would always start with those kinds of conditions. I would always start at a small scale so you can make your mistakes at a small scale, right, until you get more used to it. And then over time, you can always add new pastures as you maybe get more comfortable with it and decide you want to go further down that road. The ultimate ratio on a farm is going to have to do with latitude. So in Tennessee, I might argue that we could go with 40 or 50% warm season grasses. Up here, my best guess is 20% will be about all you need, just because we're that much further north, and the severity of droughts and the length of summer is that much less. So that 20% is not magic. It's kind of based on some data that shows historical baselines of proportions of C4 grasses at this latitude in this part of the world. So those would be some guidelines for how to start into this process. So, one last question. Who's got the last question? Nobody's got the last question. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. You saved the day. Yeah, so if I followed the question was, do native grasses reduce heat stress, and is that part of the explanation for the high rates of gain? Yeah. In the case of fescue, which we're blessed with lots and lots of at our latitude, you know, we get what we call fescue toxicosis, right? So the alkaloids in the fescue basically give the cattle a fever. And so absolutely, they are under stress in the summer where they have a lot of fescue in their diet. Up here, I've seen fescue up here, but you know, it might be 10% of a pasture on average.
And we have
The novel. Yeah. So I don't think there's any heat stress associated with cool season forages up here, and I don't think the warm season grasses meaningfully reduce heat stress in any way, right? Because again, if you're grazing them right, you know, they're all below the cow's belly, right? Or you know, maybe barely rubbing it. So it's not like they're providing shade to the animals or anything. So I think those rates of gain are really just because the proteins bypass proteins and the digestible carbohydrates that are in there. It's what they're eating. So, folks, I'm going to wrap it up because y'all been very patient. It's late. I am perfectly happy to stick around and answer questions to individuals, but I don't want to hold everybody because maybe y'all need to go home and go to bed or milk cows or do something. So I want to thank again Carly for stirring the pot and making this happen. Thank you, Keagan, for participating. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And I hope this has at least given you something to think about, right? And again, love to trick some of y'all up here at these northern latitudes into planting some of this, just to teach us all something, right? But thank you for your time. And again, I will be around for a while to try to answer questions. So, God bless and have a great evening.